Jacob LaRosa murdered a 94-year-old woman, my mother, a 94-year-old woman who was living actively and independently, a 94-year-old woman with lots of life left in her, a 94-year-old woman who was born on and lived virtually her entire life on Cherry Avenue, a 94-year-old woman who felt safe and secure in familiar surroundings, a 94-year-old woman who deserved to die of natural causes, peacefully in her bed. Before my mother was brutally robbed, burglarized, and murdered, she still had her health, her wit, her humor, her dignity, her grace, her determination, her stamina, her joyfulness, and her hobbies. One of her hobbies was cooking, a passion she pursued her entire adult life. Another hobby was fly fishing, something she learned to do on her 90th birthday. She was a fly fishing celebrity who was featured in articles in Trout Unlimited magazine and Orvis edition. On March 31st, 2015, the worst day of my mother's life and mine, I felt as if I were watching a horror movie. As the details of Jacob LaRosa's abominable crime rolled out, I was shocked, incredulous, confused, angry, and nauseated. I couldn't believe this happened to my dear, sweet, precious mother. I asked my husband, who would do such a thing? Who would ever want to hurt my mother? Everyone who knew Marie loved Marie, everyone. My poor younger sister had the misfortune to discover our mother's body amidst a grisly scene. On our drive to Niles, the evening of the murder, my mind was racing. Would my sister ever recover from this trauma of finding my mother? What will we say to our children? What will our children say to our grandchildren? What words could possibly be used to soften the blow? Would our children and grandchildren who idolized my mother ever be able to comprehend this heinous, barbaric, unthinkable crime? Would our grandchildren have nightmares about the gruesome death of their beloved Gigi? Would they be scarred for life? Your Honor, I will never understand how Jacob LaRosa, who knew my mother from the time he was a little boy, could take her life. Many were the times Jacob sat by my mother's side on her front porch, where he received my mother's full attention and kindness. My mother had many little flowers, or little fiotis, as she said in her Italian accent. Among them were her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, her nieces, nephews, cousins, friends, and neighbors. Yes, Jacob LaRosa was one of her little flowers. Everyone loved Marie, everyone. She loved life. She loved teaching others, whether she was sharing one of her recipes, one of her Bible verses, or one of life's lessons that she learned during her long and sometimes difficult life. My mother, like many members of the greatest generation, grew up poor during the Great Depression. During World War II, my mother did factory work while my father served in the Army Air Corps. When my father, after 2 strokes, could no longer work, my mother then in her 60s, obtained a driver's license and worked as a school bus aide and a school bus driver. Despite her hard life, my mother shared and loved sharing. She was so generous, so kind, so helpful, so thoughtful, so spiritual, and she was by far the most unselfish person I have ever known in my life. Yes, she was my mother, and most people think that their mothers are the best, but she really was the best, and she proved it over and over again to friends, family, neighbors, and strangers. Your Honor, please imagine, if you will, how difficult it was to telephone my daughter and my son to tell them that their precious, beloved grandmother was dead, telling them how she died, and telling them that some deranged beast attempted to rape her. Further, imagine what it was like to hear our daughter say to my husband, "Dad, I don't think I'll ever be happy again." Excuse me. On the evening of the murder, we turned on the television news to watch the interview of a young neighbor girl. She said that Jacob went to her house looking for her, but she wasn't at home. She felt bad because she thought, had she been home, Jacob might not have gone to my mother's house. She said, "If I had been home, he may not have hurt Mrs. Belcastro." I thought, thank God you weren't home. You might have been the victim instead of my mother. I like to think that God protected this little girl from Jacob LaRosa. I like to believe that it was God's will that my mother died a martyr. Jacob beat my mother so brutally that the coroner couldn't even estimate the number of times he hit her. Whether before or after he beat her, he tried to rape her. Such crimes and indignities are beyond the pale, outrageous and barbaric. What kind of human being could do these things to a sweet, kind, loving, fragile, 87-pound, 94-year-old woman? What kind of human being repays kindness with unadulterated evil acts? My sister and I are devastated. My children are shocked and shattered. My grandchildren, who up until March 31st of 2015 were trusting, loving children, they are now profoundly damaged. Jacob LaRosa robbed them of their adoring Gigi. He took away their innocence. He demonstrated beyond all doubt that pure evil exists and is running the streets. Long after their tears have stopped flowing, and the tears have not yet stopped flowing, what long-term damage can we expect? Will Marie's great-grandchildren be hardened by this event? Will they grow calluses around their heart? Will they be forever fearful and suspicious of other people? Will they be capable of empathy, of friendship, of love? Will they ever be able to trust other people? I hate all the horrible things that Jacob LaRosa did to my mother, but I hate what he's done to my children and my grandchildren just as much. To add a final insult to his list of heinous criminal acts, Jacob LaRosa robbed Marie's family and friends of our last goodbyes. Our hearts were crushed when we learned that my mother's face and head were so disfigured that the mortician could not prepare her body for an open casket. We, her family and friends, were denied the opportunity to see her resting in peace. We were denied the opportunity to say a proper goodbye. Your Honor, as a Christian, I know very well that God asks me to forgive Jacob LaRosa. He doesn't ask me to forget. I'll never be able to forget him. I'll never forget what he did to terrorize and brutalize my poor, dear, sweet, precious mother. And I'll never forget what he did to my sister, my children, and my precious grandchildren. I hope that he never forgets my mother and what he did to her. I hope that someday he'll realize what he has done and ask God to forgive him. In the end, however, it is God Almighty who will judge him. I thank God for my faith. It's gotten me through many, many sleepless nights. I thank God for my husband, who is like a son to my mother. I thank God for family and for friends. I thank God for the Niles Police Department, the Trumbull County prosecutors, the citizens of Trumbull County, and finally, for the criminal justice system. I thank God that Jacob LaRosa cannot be put to death, so that every day for the rest of his life, he will remember my mother, what she did for him, and what he did to her. It is my belief that Jacob LaRosa is incorrigible and unredeemable. He needs to be locked up for life, not just for punishment, not just for an example, but most importantly, to protect society from evil, from his predatory nature. He cannot be allowed to roam the streets ever again. I pray for a life sentence without parole. Marie Belcastro, may she be his last victim.